It was a different day.
But probably not chocolate would be good.
Well, we had 5, so
Yeah, I know you did.
oh, none of them went on.
There you go.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
She never could win.
They all watched. They all
And
watched.
original your kids.
All righty, so let's go ahead and get started. If somebody rolls in, they roll in. I'm still trying to figure out how exactly I want this class to go. Maybe I'll figure that out by the time it's over. But one of the things while I was rereading through my notes and reading Mark chapter 4 itself, I thought maybe approaching this chapter and the book and chapter 4 and Mark, it might be a good idea to take a look at it from an exegetical perspective. Does anyone know what exegesis is?
Analysis.
Okay, very good.
Outside or beyond Jesus. I knew it when it came out of my mouth.
No.
I get it.
Exegesis is, I guess, kind of no, it is. In part, it's what I do every week that I preach. I sit down with the text, I read the text, and after I read it and the Holy Spirit doesn't give me any great ideas, then I start studying. And part of that study is exegesis. It's an official definition is a critical explanation or interpretation of a text. So, as we read and as we go through Mark chapter 4, I'm going to ask you to put your preacher hat on and think about how you might critically interpret this text. Because one of the things about Mark chapter 4 is that it's really the first time Jesus is doing what? Preaching and teaching, and he is using what? What's synonymous with Jesus's preaching? Parables. Very good. And I think it took me about 2 or 3 years into being a pastor to realize that I think I'd been doing preaching parables wrong. And we don't take them seriously enough, and they aren't rooted enough in real life. And when we don't do that, we kind of miss the point of what it is they're trying to say. And one of the things I really appreciate about Ched Myers here is that he really wants to root parables in real life. Like, he doesn't want you to think, oh, this is just about the end times, or this isn't just about heaven. It has a practical, real application that people are really and truly connecting with, which is one of the reasons why exegesis is so important. Understanding how those people would read that and hear that compared to us, and then trying to, cross the span of 2,000, 1,500 years or so. So, how should we read parables? How should we read parables? You don't have to give me Myers' explanation for how we should read parables.
According to the Lutheran study guide.
Yeah.
It does say something,
Just own it.
no, because I mean. It says something about, does the parable reflect upon what God does or what we do, or how it affects our belief? I don't know, parables was in the footnote.
Okay.
I would say how I look at it was, what is Jesus saying about how I should live my life? What I need to do differently or more of or less of.
Okay. Yeah. One of the things we're going to talk about, and one of the things Myers really dives deep into here, is why does Jesus teach in parables, or what's the point of it?
parables as opposed to just saying that, right?
Yeah, instead of teaching in parables, you could just say what you mean,
Makes it more relatable, maybe.
makes it more relatable.
Makes people stop and think.
Okay, yeah, there's a requirement to spend a little more, bit more brain cells on it.
Take in metaphors, if I can make that synonymous with parables, they take in metaphors at a different level in their brain. And it stays with them, and integrates in a different way than words do, or I mean, just. Straightforward.
Also, we're trying to put it back on the level of the common man.
Mhm,
It's not well educated.
mhm.
Yeah, I think that's
There's
applicable here.
pictures involved, like images that we see.
one of the things, Myers quotes another New Testament theologian, Tannehill, and he quotes him, and I want to read it. And he's talking about parables. The surprising twist, because most of Jesus's parables twist. A surprising twist invites the hearer to cross over and see what the speaker sees. Such a bridge cannot be built in the public world of literal meanings, the world reduced to what all accept for purposes of interpersonal commerce. For this public world is itself being challenged. The speaker must disclose truth by using words which, taken literally, are false, as happens in the case of metaphor. The words are successful insofar as they are able to induce an imaginative vision with sufficient power to undermine the obviousness of literal meanings. And what I like about what Tannehill is saying here and what Meyer says happens in Mark is that it's hard to use in some ways the language of the time and just say what you mean, because so much of what you're trying to get across challenges the world that people understand. And you have to do that. Jesus has to do that in some ways with the parables, and has to do it successfully to get people to understand what it is he's trying to say. So this idea of teaching in parables is not something unique to Jesus, but how effective these parables are by Jesus is something of note. People who don't even go to church are aware of some of Jesus's parables. I mean, that's just,
Yes,
people have heard that.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
these are
yes.
pieces of wisdom that have carried on throughout the ages. And that speaks to the effectiveness of Jesus' teaching and his use of parables. He's trying to convey something that people just really won't understand. And he tries to get them to use their imagination and to think about it at a deeper level. And he's very, very good at being able to get people to where they want to go. But as we're going to talk about, there is definitely a disconnect, and there are definitely people who understand, and there are definitely people who don't understand. And one of the things Myers wants to point out for us is trying to understand what it means to be a person who is either on the in or the out. More often we find ourselves on the outside looking in. But Myers lists four main characteristics of Jesus' parables in Mark. And the first one is that they function as a mirror to help the hearer understand the narrative of Jesus' practice. Mark tells us that the parable of the sower and its interpretation is crucial to interpret or to understand not only this one parable, but all Jesus's teachings. So with that being said, let's start putting on our exegesis hats and let's read Mark 4, verses 1 through 9. Mark 4, verses 1 through 9. Again, he began to teach beside the sea. Such a very large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat on the sea and sat there, while the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. He began to teach them, saying many things in parables, and in his teachings he said to them, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on the rocky ground, where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell into the good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30, 60, and 100-fold. And he said, let anyone with ears to hear listen." So, Mark says that the parable of the sower is crucial in interpreting Jesus' teaching and the rest of Jesus' parables. Why is that? Why is this parable so central to interpreting the rest of Jesus' teaching?
Right, wrong, what it says to me is that you speak, so the stories come out, so the learning comes out, but not everybody's gonna get it.
Very good.
Yay.
First job. Jesus right here lays out, listen to me. And then he's saying, someone goes out and they start spreading seed. Some of that seed is going to just fall out on the ground and get blown away. Some's going to take root and, not very deep. It's going to grow and it's going to be scorched. But some will find that right soil and will really grow firm, set in, and bear all kinds of wonderful fruits. So right here, Jesus is outlining that there are going to be some people for whom the seed just does not take root. So not only is this a parable for those listening, it's a parable for who? Yeah. It's a parable for the disciples. It's a parable for us. I just had a meeting with somebody a week or two ago who's very frustrated that in some ways that this person or these people in their lives wouldn't come back to church. And this parable would have been perfect had it come to mind to say, some seed just doesn't fall, or it's not the time for it to fall and to take root. And that's frustrating for us. But we're going to get back to why, as sowers, our job is to scatter the seed, not to ensure its growth and how much it takes root. But very good. This is crucial to interpreting all other parables, is that sometimes it's going to land and take root, other times it's not. Another reason, or another characteristic of Jesus' parables, is that they might be necessary. And they might be necessary in, anybody want to guess or anybody know?
They might be necessary.
Why might they be necessary for Jesus to speak in parables?
Along the time that he can spread his message for getting clamped down by the authorities.
A lot of that time people spoke in the oral tradition. Storytelling was very much a way of explaining what you believe and what message you wanted to get across to them. It was in terms that they could understand.
Yeah, so that's definitely true. And I think you were sniffing on the right trail of Jesus has to use parables to not get arrested.
Right.
He can't come out and say exactly what it is that he wants to say. So he has to tell these stories in parables. And all of this teaching comes, we talked about it in our last class. He's facing scribal authorities who have been challenging him. I mean, he's just been accused of being possessed by a demon or being Satan or Beelzebub or whatever. So Jesus will use parables in some ways because he can't just say what it is that he wants to say. Now, is this unique to Jesus? No. This is actually kind of unique to the Hebrew tradition. So this is something Ezekiel uses, and Ezekiel is pretty well known for. So Ezekiel chapter 17, verse 2, Son of man, propound a riddle and speak an allegory to the house of Israel. So kind of, I mean, those are translations of Hebrew words that kind of encapsulate what a parable is. Then in chapter 20, verse 49, is he not a maker of allegories? And then chapter 24, verse 3 of Ezekiel, utter an allegory to this rebellious house. So it is a political necessity that as Jesus is challenging the strong man, the powers of the status quo, he has to use this imagery. And this is something that exists today in non-biblical terms. Sometimes people can't come out and say what they want to say about, an institution or, a government officials. You think in, dictatorships or other tyrannical governments, you could get in a lot of trouble for saying something negative about a leader. So imagery and stories, illusions.
Married kids.
Yeah.
I'm gonna talk a little politically with them.
Yeah. So there's you make these illusions to where people hearing it are like, yeah, I kind of get what it is you're saying, but because you're not using names, not using specific titles, that there is that kind of, people know what you're saying for the most part. The struggle for us is what?
Understanding them.
I would say the struggle for us is that we don't always get what it is that Jesus is saying. We don't understand the context in which he's preaching, which is why reading scripture isn't, reading scripture is part of it. Studying it and learning about it is very important for us.
Until I read part of today's lesson about the one piece of bread and the whole bread thing, never did I think about taking care of people in front of us, and reaching into our own pockets and all of that. So that was an interesting slant on it.
Yeah, I mean, you learn a lot just by hearing and seeing a parable from someone else's perspective, which I think is one of the reasons why exegesis is so important. And different theologians, different Bible doctorates and biblical studies, different language specialists, they all offer their own views in their historical contexts and stuff like that. So Ched Myers's view is not the only view out there. I just think it's a very helpful one. The third characteristic is the political character of the discourse goes a long way towards clarifying Mark's notion of hearing but not understanding. Hearing but not understanding. Here, Jesus and Mark appeals to Isaiah, and that's kind of where this language is being taken from. If you didn't know, Jesus uses most of his connection to Hebrew is through the prophetic texts, which should also help us understand that Jesus is a political figure trying to make political changes in the time, because the prophets are, by their very nature, political beings operating in the political sphere to which they lived. The sower of the parable reflects the obstacles encountered by those on Jesus's mission, chiefly Jesus at the beginning. This is the mission that the disciples will inherit, and later it is the mission that we inherit. But it is important, and it's something we have to keep in mind going forward. But as we read the parables, are we hearing or are we understanding? Because there is a difference. And that's why Jesus in Mark cites Isaiah 6, whom shall I send? This idea of who understands this, who can go out. And this fits in with the apocalyptic tradition. And one of the things we talked about, apocalyptic means what?
You told us.
I did tell you.
There wasn't enough courage.
Does it mean end times?
Beginnings. Yeah.
Beginnings and ends,
Yeah.
but apocalypsis in Greek means to reveal, which is why Revelation, which is why we call it the book of Revelation. It's the book of Apocalypse. This apocalyptic tradition, this literature, is that some things are being revealed to people and to others they aren't. But Ched Myers also wants us to understand that this message, some people might not understand, but some people might and choose to reject it. So it's not only something being revealed that some people get and other people don't, but it's also polarizing, and that those who wish to follow and those who choose to reject will find themselves going out on different paths and will be separate. This kind of brings in, though it's something we struggle with, it brings into mind the Exodus, when God hardens the heart of Pharaoh. This kind of polarization of there being two separate sides. God, in Jesus's messianic mission, is aware of and is going to create that separation and that polarization. There's going to be distance between the two sides, and that's something that the parables are going to do. Finally, parables, I think this is what I struggled with as a pastor at the beginning, but are often understood as earthly stories with heavenly meanings, right? That's kind of, I think, what, that's what we teach in Sunday school. Ched Myers says that's exactly what they're not. They are not earthly stories with heavenly meanings. Ched Myers utterly disagrees that that's what parables are. He says Mark's overall strategy is to keep grounded or realistic these revelatory apocalyptic symbols of his teachings. So he's not trying to tell earthly stories with heavenly meanings. He's trying to tell heavenly stories in grounded reality. That he's trying to speak of real things that are happening, real things that he wants to see done in ways that people will understand. In some ways, I'm revealing this to you in a way you should be able to understand. It's not something we experience and then try and transpose. It's Jesus is saying, this is happening right now. This is grounded in reality today. And part of using these parables is to get people to understand that this is a now thing, not a then thing. We're not waiting for this. This is happening now. Jesus insists in Mark and Matthew and Luke that the kingdom is like this.
Why did Chad Myers choose Mark over Matthew or Luke or something? Do you think?
Well, I know
Okay.
first, I can't say I know, no. Myers talks about it as he writes. But Mark is the get down to action. This is what Jesus did. It's the most closely tied, I would say, to the truth true source of the Gospels is Mark, and what it is. A lot of Matthew and Luke probably have outside influences in some way, shape, or form. They might have stories, but they change a little bit, and their messages are a little bit different. Mark is right to the point. It's action. It's quick. And it speaks, I think, more to Matthew, Luke, and John are all very concerned with getting you to understand what Jesus did, but also with what that's ushering in. Mark is far more concerned with you understanding what Jesus was doing then and how it had real grounded purpose. Matthew, Luke, and John, I think, point to more heavenly, beyond death and resurrection type things, where Mark's very rooted in the life today, what Jesus was doing then. Not, Jesus' life isn't something to be skipped past or ignored in some ways. Like there was a real there was a reality there that Jesus was attempting to shape that Mark truly gets to the heart of. And that's Jesus bringing the theology of the kingdom and the parables in a concrete way, in a way that people can understand. So let's do it. Let's try and figure out how we would preach the parable of the sowers, so to speak. How is the parable itself bookended?
Well, I see the listen.
Yeah. That's what
Beginning, it's like, hey.
Yeah.
Listen, the
Listen.
sower went out to sow. And when he's done teaching, he says, let anyone with ears to hear listen. So there is this command, and this reflects, does anybody guess?
Oh, in that beginning. Of Mark, or, no, there was not one.
I was thinking in the,
Tell you or whatever.
so when Moses is handing out the 10 commandments, hear you, O Israel, listen to the Lord your God. So in some ways, this is an appeal that, the 10 commandments are in some way handed down as, we like to think it as a statute or law, but in some ways they're a gift, and they provide this they're a curriculum towards an education of how to live within the life that God has called us to live. Jesus is in some ways offering this teaching as new commandments, as a new understanding of how we are called to live, which is why it's kind of bookended with that listen, and let anyone with ears to hear listen. So it's very important that as Jesus is doing this, he's bookending it with that. What is unique about this parable? Not the story itself, but mainly what happens after the parable. Yeah, what happens after this parable that doesn't happen too often with parables?
So when he comes back and says, to you, you have been given the secret of the kingdom of God.
Well, here in Mark, starting with chapter 4, verse 10, Jesus is going to explain the purpose of parables and the meaning of the parable of the sower. More often than not, when we hear a parable, that's it. We're left to kind of make sense of that on our own. But here in Mark 4, beginning with verse 10, Jesus will explain his use of parables and explain the parable of the sower. First off, who is around to hear this? Is it everyone he was teaching before?
Says the 12.
The 12. So this special instruction is only for his disciples. And it should also be of note that this special instruction now, Mark is sharing of Jesus, is for us. right? So there's this idea of I am explaining to you this thing. You know, you are hearing something that those first people who heard this parable never received. Jesus explaining why he preaches in parables and what this parable means. And what's interesting about this in verse 13, what does Jesus ask? Do you not understand this parable? Then how will you understand all the parables? So we like to think, oh, you know, the disciples are probably in the know. They probably have ears to listen. But here, clearly, at the onset, Jesus is like, are you telling me you don't get this? How do you expect us to go any further? If it's like my math teachers, all my math teachers growing up after, you know, junior high was over into high school. It's like, Brad, how are we going to build from here when you can't get day one? And I mean, I think it's a source of frustration for Jesus to be like, really? We're already wondering. I thought this one was pretty clear. So Jesus is willing. I like to think of Jesus willing to baby, you know, help them along a little bit here at the beginning. So what he does, and I think maybe the reason why we have this explanation is because it's very important that they understand this. As this is going to be their calling, it's very important that they understand. The first two in Jesus's explanation, the first two scatterings of seed represent those who fall away immediately as they hear the word. Those whom the word never really takes root. So what is the obstacle or the obstacles for those?
The particulars of the true believers and the non-believers, and there's a separation that believers need. You understand it will be non-believers in the way of separating them.
I think he is highlighting, he wants them to understand that there will be people for whom what you're saying will not take root. So there will be people who believe, who understand, and there will be people who will not. But what is the obstacle that he says leads to this?
Snag. Trouble, persecution, running the hard times, they immediately fall away from what they've learned.
Well, I see, okay, so this says Satan immediately comes and takes away the word. And it's like, okay, well, that's just gonna happen. The second one's like, they receive it with joy. It's like that. Met that person that is like the new thing. They've just got their multi-level marketing kit and they're like, you know, but that doesn't last very long. Sorry. But y'all let me know.
Yeah, you're good.
But I see the obstacle as maybe it's the human, I mean, Satan's in there, maybe it's just, you know. You're not just being a human, you're not paying attention to that or.
Well, I think what we're going to attempt to do right here is to root these in reality, to make them applicable. And to say Satan makes it seem supernatural to some degree, which is not what I want, but there is that outright. I don't know if that's exactly the way I would explain it, but there is that outright, like, oh, I know better. Like, this is stupid. Like
human wickedness, or whatever, just that idea.
Just that I don't have time for this. What is this? Like they hear it and immediately it's just gone. Like, I have no time for this. And whatever that objection is, maybe hearing the gospel can make people angry. I've seen it. But there is, like, these are people, and Jesus refers to Satan, which is another idea of the strong man. But he is pointing out to which group specifically in his time and in this place. what group would be those who immediately hear and reject?
The people in power, they're.
He is speaking about the scribes who just called him Satan.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, the scribal authority. He is saying right here, you know, we just had this discussion with the scribes about Satan. Satan takes them away. Everything Jesus says, they outright reject from the very beginning, have no time for it. None whatsoever. And Jesus will continue in this battle. You know, Satan in Hebrew means adversary or accuser. Who else will Jesus see as Satan, or will struggle against Satan in the form of? Peter. Peter will have heard numerous times Jesus saying, you know, I'm going to go die. Like, this is going to lead to my death. To every time Peter responding, what? I don't know what he's talking about. This is making me nervous. Till finally he's like, no, I won't allow this to happen. He's a stumbling block. He's standing in the way. He's hearing what Jesus is saying and before just rejecting it wholesale. So there are those where the seed is going to be scattered and it is just not going to take root. And we can see that. We can see that in the world. But I think this next one might be more. I think this is one I honestly see more often. And that's probably just because of my profession. But in contrast with the first two, the next two genuinely hear the word, but the fruit isn't great, right? It doesn't really take root. And what is the obstacle for them? Very good. I think this is the idea of like when the rubber meets the road, how invested are you actually in it? The worries of this age, the lure of wealth, and the other passions and interests that we have. And this kind of speaks not only to Jesus' time, but who do you think Mark might be writing to? What? Pharisees? Let's think of Mark. Mark's writing to the early growing church. People who hear this message and are coming into church, but then any challenge arises whatsoever, or they're, you know, seen as not living the way that the community is being called to live because their interests truly lie outside of that. Mark's highlighting this parable and Jesus' explanation for those people, I think, in the early church who are lukewarm. You know, Saint John of Patmos in Revelation, I can't remember which church it is, but it says, you're lukewarm. You're the worst of us. You just stand in the middle. You know, sometimes you're here, sometimes you're not. And, you know, Jesus is saying, you know, just because you hear doesn't mean that fruit is instantly going to be great. And this is in some ways accepting discipleship and then rejecting it. Who is, and we have to be honest with ourselves, this is what he's really getting at is affluence, wealth, having money. Who is the only person in Mark to outright reject discipleship with Jesus? Who says, you know, it's a character, it's someone that we hear of, and they outright reject it.
Let's start with.
The rich man. Go and sell everything you have and follow me. And what does he do? He walks away and he's mad, but he doesn't. He doesn't. And Jesus then says what? It's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. I don't think it should be lost on us that this point is made, you know, to what extent what will you sacrifice for this? And in Jesus and Mark's experience, one thing people won't is wealth and what that affords them. So that is something, you know, clearly highlighted here. And then the last two examples are what? In the explanation.
Talking about like thorns choking it and then the other grew and flourished. I don't know which.
Yeah, glad that we were on 3, like we had already 1, 2, 3, I don't know. I'm kind of with you, I don't know exactly what the
All right.
2 are.
The seeds among the thorn.
The seeds among the thorn is kind of the ones we're talking about with the wealth, other things. Their desires for other things come in and choke the word and it yields nothing. And then these are the ones sown on the good soil. They hear the word and accept it and bear fruit 30, 60, and 100-fold. One of the things that I think is overlooked here is we all hear the gospel in our own space, in the space we occupy. And what do I mean by that?
It's different than you've heard later and you've lived more, and you've had trials and tribulations and you've gone back to the Lord.
There's definitely the context of age and time and what we learn. Yeah,
Life events.
life events. I definitely think there's the acknowledgement of sometimes in our lives, it's easy for us to hear and for Satan to take that away. I definitely feel like it's easy at times to hear the word and it falls among thorns or it doesn't take deep root. And I definitely think there are times where we are that it finds good soil. But we also have to understand that as we hear the gospel, there's going to be challenges that rival it. And that's something the Jesus in Mark really wants us to understand, that following the gospel is never easy. If we listen and do not hear, it's not because God is making us not hear. It's because our loyalty is to someone or something else, ultimately. That's really at the heart of the parable of the sower. Where does our loyalty lie? Which is why I love Luther's quote, whatever your heart clings to and confides in, that is truly your God. And showing loyalty, you know, when the cards are down, who are you going to? What are you going to try and rely on to get you through this? And I think the parable of the sower is getting people who spread the word to understand that sometimes there's just nothing you can do. It's your job only to spread the good news. Outside of that, it's beyond your control. And a big part of that is the space we occupy in the world, the way we see the world. And that takes us into a lamp under a bushel basket. Man, I have got to speed this up. I'm going way too slow. What has once been a mystery has now been revealed. It's important for us to understand that in this context, there's a lot of things, you know, Jesus is a divine revelation of what God wanted us to know when Jesus came. It's not everything, but it is what God wants us to know. All right. But that mystery is no longer a mystery, right? Jesus has come to reveal it, to make it public. The disciples will be sent out to make it public. Mark is writing it down so that it will be public knowledge. You know, we can't say in some ways like, oh, I didn't know, or I didn't understand, or geez, like Jesus, the disciples, and Mark writing this gospel are trying to get you to understand there is no longer any mystery here to what God wants us to do and who God is calling us to be. That mystery before Jesus, there was mystery. After Jesus, there is none. Right? This thing has been revealed, which is why he uses the imagery beginning with verse 21. He said to them, is a lamp brought in to be put under the bushel basket or under the bed and not on the lampstand? For there is nothing hidden except to be disclosed, nor is anything secret except to come to light. Let anyone with ears to hear listen. And he said to them, pay attention to what you hear. The measure you give will be the measure you get, and still more will be given you. For to those who have, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. Now we're going to talk about that last little part here in a minute. But the term mystery is a very loaded term in this time. Why do anybody have any idea why mystery would be a loaded term?
You're talking the other week about the magic.
Very good.
The ether, the way people behave was like, oh, that's magical.
Yeah.
Jesus magical.
There's this kind of arcane, like magical knowledge. One of the early heresies in the church was Gnosticism. Have you ever heard of Gnosticism? So it's kind of this belief that Jesus came to impart some spiritual wisdom and knowledge that could allow you to transcend your human form. And what Mark's trying to say, there's no more mystery. Like, this is it. I'm not coming to take this lamp and put it under a bushel or under the bed. Like, this mystery is being revealed in this moment. So Mark doesn't want anyone who hears or reads the gospel to think Jesus is trying to impart some magic powers or arcane knowledge. He's merely revealing the will of God. So there's nothing special about it in that way, which would have been what a lot of people, anytime they heard mystery, would have associated, an arcane magical language or knowledge for them to hear and to use. How do I want to make this point? I think it's important. Ideology of the land, ancient agrarian culture, and our disconnect. So I'm just going to try and make this real fast. This parable is not so wishful thinking, it is subversive. Myers writes, a Palestinian farmer might expect to yield a 7-to-1 ration, right? With a 10-fold yield considered a bumper crop, a good year. The parable's harvest thus symbolically represents a dramatic shattering of the vassal relationship between peasant and landlord. This surplus, a farmer could not only eat, pay tithes, rent, and debts, but could even purchase the land itself and end his servitude forever. Jesus says that the kingdom of God is like this. It envisions the abolition of the oppressive relationships of production that determine the future of the farmer's social world. Mark is articulating an ideology of the land and the revolutionary hopes of those who work it. So one of the things that I'm really sad we're not going to get to talk to about, because I thought it was kind of the crux of this, but we'll start, is, in some sense, we think of this as just being about the kingdom of God and faith and belief. But there is to be expected the fruits of the kingdom to be life-changing and world-altering in the present moment in some ways. Jesus is saying that these systems of oppression that exist are things that are going to break as the fruits of the Spirit begin to grow, that this fruit bearing is going to change the world, that the way people lived, all these people that Jesus is preaching to, their lives is a type of stress I don't think I could quite live with. Their entire source of well-being, providing for their family, everything exists in the crop they bring. And every year they're lucky if they can break even, have enough to feed their family, pay the temple taxes, pay for the sacrifices, pay their taxes, pay their landlords. Like they live on that meager existence of harvest to harvest. And it is stressful and they barely make it. And the first time they don't make it, what happens? They're out and someone else is in. They're out and somebody else is in. And Jesus is offering an alternative worldview that is very alien to people at the time. And that is a liberation for you to be free from this type of servitude, from working in this system. And I think even though it's hard for us to understand this agrarian nature of how to live, I mean, maybe I should end the recording for a little bit. Because I'm gonna talk about something I'm not supposed to. Recording. There we go.
It's like a pinnacle.
It is. It is like if not enough's being brought in, then we cut people away. We're all like me, you, like our future is invested in the stock market. And there's this like insatiable need that if it stops growing, all of a sudden we're all in huge trouble. That like this need to fuel the machine, to grow, to whether we like it or not, we have to realize and understand that we live and put ourselves into a machine that needs to always be moving forward and is more than willing to run over people so long as it keeps still going forward. Jesus is challenging the agrarian culture of the time and the way that these peasants, the way that these people are treated by those who have step on them a higher rung on the social ladder. He is speaking out against them. We also need to be aware of where we are in the system. We think we have it the worst, or we think we have it bad. We don't. We also need to be aware that there are people driving this or driving us towards, I don't even think like the strongman is an idea. It's not a person, it's an idea, it's a belief system that propels us forward thinking this is the only way to live. This is the only way you'll be able to retire. Jesus is offering is there is a world outside of this, if you are willing to step into it and to live into it. And I think this is the beginning of the challenge for us, is to understand in the parable of the sower, yes, Jesus is talking about people hearing the gospel and that taking root. But while he's doing that, he is challenging the economic practices and social well-being of those who farm and live outside of the centers of power, and saying, when the kingdom comes, or when the kingdom begins to take root, there will be fruit. God's kingdom does not operate in a place where you're going to have to worry about producing every year or being thrown to the side and discarded. This is a direct challenge to the economic practices that these people live under. And I don't think, because it's in agrarian terms, that doesn't mean it doesn't apply to us in our own today. The biggest struggle, I think, and this is maybe where I'm going with my sermon on Sunday, is what does it require for us to do to hear Jesus and to step out?
And wait for your answer on Sunday.
I'm gonna wait for my answer on Sunday. That's what they said.
Because it may be the right answer.
Oh, I don't know
Like some
about that.
history.
So I've got a question.
Shoot.
So have you kind of gone full circle now? So the discussion that you just had in terms of the agrarian economy and the impact that it has on the populace and so forth. It goes back to what you were saying earlier, that you said that basically one of the purposes for the parables is to serve a political need without actually expressing the political need.
Yeah.
And is he, in saying this, I'm just playing off your words, is he shaking his finger, right, at the circumstances of the day, the leaders, those who are in economic power, and saying, this is not right, guys. This is not what we should be doing. We should be thinking differently. We should be thinking about the betterment of all and so on and so forth, but without saying it. Because if he had said it directly, if he got up on a soapbox and started to shake his finger at people, he would have suffered dire consequences much faster than what he eventually did. I'm
You're
just
absolutely-
curious.
You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. The work of the prophet famously is, I think Reinhold Niebuhr said this, the work of the prophet is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So those who live under the yoke of this system and struggle with it are hearing what Jesus says as good news, but well, not yet. Well, no, I'm not buying anything. But those, there are scribes there listening. Like, it is not just the people on Jesus's team. There are scribes there. There are people who are benefiting from this system, who are hearing Jesus say that and who are smart enough to know this is a challenge. You are speaking about the world we live in and the way of this world goes, and you're saying it's not right. Because
He's becoming a political heretic for them.
yeah, I mean, I think I can't remember if it's in Sunday school or sermon or, Jesus isn't killed because he claims to be the Son of God. Jesus is killed because he is a political challenger to the status quo and is calling everybody who's benefiting from these systems of injustice into account. And that's, I think, ultimately what Ched Myers wants us to understand about the Gospels, about Jesus, is that more often than not, the kingdom of God stands in opposition to all of our understandings of power and how they should be wielded. The kingdom of God says there's enough for all. Ever since humanity's existed, there's never been that belief system. You have to take what you can get. You have to take it. Then it can be distributed when you have enough, when I have enough, when I can be safe, when I can ensure my security. But I think what the Gospels require us to do is dive deep and allow ourselves to be challenged, because I have witnessed time and time again, anytime you have Jesus challenge someone's status and their worldview, that it instantly, I think, becomes that first example in the parable of the sower of just, I don't have time for this. No. And I think that's very scribal, very pharisaic of us to just, I don't want to hear this, blah, 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 blah. I mean, I left my first church in Golden, Illinois. I had preached some sermons that were political of nature, though I didn't name names or anything like that. And I remember it had like 7 people in my office on a Monday. It's which was my new record. And I went, some of them came in together, which was even more fun. But Karen, who is my secretary and a confidant, I mean, basically Will's grandma and in the time, she's like, I don't understand why people get upset. I just tell them that if they don't like what you're saying, they shouldn't listen. And it was kind of like, that's not what I want. Like, I want them to listen. I want them to hear. And I want them to be challenged and uncomfortable by that. I mean, it took me time to realize, like, I can't just be challenging other people. I have to be challenged myself, which I think sometimes I was too hard on myself and sometimes maybe not hard enough. But I think that whenever a pastor feels like the congregation is no longer listening, that's the time that the pastor has to leave. And it's very applicable to the parable of the sower. I was challenging people to look at the world a different way. That was very clearly the gospel as I understood it. And I had scriptural backing. I was pretty confident that Jesus challenged that worldview. And most people either shut me out and didn't listen, or just tried to forget about it, and other people got really mad. And I think that's why we go to churches where we're told what we want to hear. Any follow-ups?
I think it's important to have good discourse. It's fascinating that you had people that had the courage to come to your office.
They had the courage to come yell at me, not to discuss. So I will tell you, after that sermon, I preached and I said, if anybody wants to discuss this after church, I'm canceling Sunday school and we're just going to talk about my sermons.
That's okay.
And I had 30 people stay. It was bigger than any Sunday school class I had ever taught. And this was after, some of you might remember Michael Brown, the guy that was choked to death outside of St. Louis and, by St. Louis police. And the first person who stood up said, I never called anyone racist. I mean, not even close. But he said, none of us, I'm not racist. I swam with the colored kids at the Bowen pool. And that was, for the most part, a segregated pool. Like, that was the only one where there was like black kids and white kids were allowed to swim together, just at different times. And K Lord was, I shouldn't have said his name. But this person wasn't racist because they would swim with the colored kids. And I was like, if this is where we're starting, but that's like different worldviews. And I agree. I always appreciated the people who are willing to come in, whether it be to yell at me or whether it be to have conversations, as opposed to those who just shut down or those who get mad and never say anything. But I think it creates a system where the word can't be heard if people just, oh, here he goes again, I'm shutting down. Because I think that very much falls within the parable of the sower. And that as a pastor, it feels like every time I throw the seed out, it's instantly going into the thorns or, just staying on the topsoil or whatever.
That had to feel pretty bad.
But
That had to be hard.
I mean, sometimes it's lonely up there. But you have to stand behind what you say too, and know. I mean, I never preached any of those sermons at the belief that everyone would welcome that.
Just like Jesus.
No, I'm not like Jesus in any way.
But that was how he approached it. Not everybody was gonna like what he had to say.
Yeah, except the one thing that I will give Jesus credit for. Jesus,
The one thing.
no, not the one thing, but Jesus went out full well knowing that not only are these people not going to like it, they're going to kill me for it. Straight up. I know where this is leading. The only reason why Jesus speaks in parables at this point is because he knows it's not his time to die. The secrecy is just because my ministry has, I have stuff to do before I get killed. And that's why it goes on as long as it does. Like Jesus, like I got stuff to do before I get arrested and crucified for these things that I'm saying. And like anything, I mean, you read any, you see any politics on the news under dictators or anything like that, Jamal Khashoggi, you write enough things or you say things enough, even if you're not calling them out directly, eventually the little jabs become enough that we're going to get you. Like, everybody knows what you're talking about, though you haven't said my name. I don't care anymore. You're not going away. You're still a problem. And that's what Jesus is. He's the thorn in the side. Right now, he's challenging people to their face. And we've gone over. So next week, our next class, which is
9.
26.
yeah, it's the Thursday after I get back from vacation. What we're going to talk about and what I was really excited to talk about was how we're supposed to view what Jesus is saying. Is it like where does this get rooted? What are we supposed to hope for? Like, are we supposed to be cynics or supposed to be pessimistic? What is that hope supposed to breed in us? But I'll share it again at the end of our next class, but I just want to read this and then I'll let everyone go because I think it's really important. I want to hammer it home. What Mark's narrative does, what Jesus does, is he legitimizes, gives credence to militant direct action. It does that. Yet at the same time, it severs any absolute relationship between such action and its effectiveness throughout history. It is up to the disciple, to the reader, to sow the seed of the kingdom through nonviolent witness, and it is up to God to bring that seed to fruition. Ched Myers lifts up MLK. He says, by refusing to personify the enemy in the human face of the opposition, Mark affirms another cardinal characteristic of nonviolence, what Martin Luther King Jr. called the beloved community. The struggle for justice must always find a way to include its opponents in its vision of the future. Just as no disciple is infallible, no adversary is disposable. So this is to say, Jesus calls his disciples and to us to a nonviolent witness to sow the seed of the kingdom, all the while still speaking about a direct action will be coming. And, I think that's what connects Mark, the Gospels, to the book of Revelation. Like there is that point where the fruits come and the new kingdom is being born, these birthing pains. It's going to be born, and that requires the death of the old world and the old systems to which many of us will probably still cling. That's got to be pulled away. But we have to hold that intention. But I think it's a great place to end this class, and I'll probably make that point again in our next class. So we'll finish this section, and then our next class. Did everybody get the next short thing of handouts? Me.
No,
So-
it locked out my computer.
Okay. We'll make sure we get you those, but we're going to be talking about one loaf, some, and then the challenge to Herod. But sound good?
Yep, thank you.
All right, go ahead, Jack.
Before everybody can go, whatever, but I have a question. This is probably more than what you want to talk about now, but so
Everyone's waiting here with bated breath.
Oh, no, they aren't. So I have some authors that I follow, and I always wonder if what they do is they want to basically start a conversation because they basically say something that is, I don't know, challenging, something that is possibly running counterintuitive to, you know, what people believe and so on and so forth. And I always have accused them of rolling the hand grenade into the room and then shutting the door just to see what's going to happen. Okay. In other words, they're basically, the conversation hasn't happened, so they're ripping the Band-Aid off, right, to force the conversation. So I was thinking about this, and then based on what you were saying, the thought that I had was, what was the conditions of the time? And this is the reason why this is too long a conversation. What were the conditions of the time that it made sense for Jesus to appear then? Because based on what we've been talking about, the politics and so forth, and in essence, he's ripping the Band-Aid off the conditions at the time to almost force the discourse that eventually would end up leading to his death. Why then? What was going on historically that made sense?
So I think part of that is, I mean, that's a much longer discussion.
Yes.
And part of the obscurity of Christianity and of Judaism is that, you know, this is taking place in the Roman Empire, but in about as backwoods, forgettable section as there is. I mean, Palestine lies relatively close to Egypt, which is, if you didn't know, the only territory, the only province of Rome that was owned by the emperor and no one else, or could be under control of no one else, was Egypt. And that was because of its grain supply, and how important that was to the empire. So this idea that Palestine, it's not important, you know, it's not. But what it has is these really crazy, weird monotheists who cannot for the life of them accept the idea that Caesar is their god, just will not do it. And what you have stepping onto the stage in this moment, in the time of Jesus, is the amplification of people in Israel, in Palestine, Jews, the zealots, who are just fed up. I mean, 30 years after Jesus dies, the temple will be destroyed. You know, you'll have that Roman Jewish war, you know, an entire fortress, Masada, people will be butchered, commit suicide. Like the tension in this moment, it's very high. You know, you have not only the people in power who are watching Jesus and are worried, you have a lot of their opponents watching Jesus wondering, is this a guy we can latch on to, or is this a guy we can get behind? Jesus also is, you know, as he's preaching this and as we're talking about nonviolence, there are zealots watching him, you know, the Sicarii, you know, the Jewish assassins, stab men who just go in town and assassinate political figures. They want Jesus to say stuff that they can rally behind. So Jesus is, I wouldn't say Jesus throws in the grenade and closes the door. I would say Jesus throws in the grenade and then steps into the room. But it is like the political tension between the powers that be in Palestine and those who are trying to challenge that authority is on the verge of spilling over. And the only thing Rome doesn't want from its provinces is for there to be issues. So Rome will become more involved as these things begin to fall apart. But Jesus is, and in a historical moment in time, there is a lot happening in this area, and that Jesus will be a huge tension on that.
He becomes the catalyst for change.
In some ways, this moment, a figure like Jesus only, I would say, amplifies or begins to spin up like how quickly things are going to happen.
Good answer. Thank you.
All right. We'll see everybody later. End recording. Have a good one, y'all.
Bye.